Welcome back to our discussion on Back to the Future. Eric and Pam here, and let's talk about some of the catchphrases that we get from Back to the Future. Phrases, of course, with such cultural relevance as "Great Scott" and "Butthead." What are some of your faves?
I always just go back to the "what's that?" Which is like the literal punchline. I don't know if that's like in my head, that's where that originates. Like the whole, getting somebody to turn around and then like splitting, or catching them off guard.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's true or not, but that's
you.
my earliest recollection of that ever being used. And, as a kid watching, you think that's hilarious. And honestly, as an adult watching it back, I still get a good chuckle out of it. So
that's funny. I can't think of another property where that is so well utilized as just
it's so
that
slapstick, but so good. Yeah.
God, there's so many. I didn't even think about like where the comedic influences, came from, kind of in the film.
It's just like, it's always like stupid lines that always stick out to me too. Like when Doc's like, "It's the Libyans. They found me."
The Libyans!
Yeah, exactly.
My God. I don't know how, but they found me. You're right. It's as much the lines as how they are delivered. Like Back to the Future is one of those. It's endlessly watchable on repeat. There's just something about the movie, and all the best comedies, all the best sci-fi movies are played, I think, straight, right? You're supposed to play it straight. There's emotional weight. There's stakes. The character really needs to succeed. The stakes couldn't be higher. He's going to disappear if he doesn't get his parents to, fall in love because he interrupted it. And that helps to ground, otherwise over the top. There's no other movie I can picture Christopher Lloyd's Doc Brown working in than the one that he's in.
No. And
he's just such a counterpoint to everything. And it's just like, this character would be too much.
The harebrained scientist, right? He's like because he's so smart that he has to be eccentric. I love the, like that the movie opens in his lab, for lack of a better word, with all the clocks and stuff like that.
It's one of the better openings of movies, and it's kind of understated because there's no music behind it.
Did you ever watch Chitty Chitty Bang Bang? Were you big on musicals as a kid? Oh my gosh, it reminds. Oh, you should watch it. It's great. Dick Van Dyke, obviously, national treasure. But yeah, he plays this character Caractacus Potts, and he's also an inventor. And obviously, like they have a flying car, so it's very. I wonder if they took some inspiration. Now that I'm like going through the movie,
now that you're really breaking it down, flying car check,
exactly,
inventor
for
check.
Back to the Future, but like I haven't seen Shitty Bang Bang forever, but just like the mental image I have of Doc's lab is very, to me, like reminiscent of the Caractacus Potts and some of the imagery you see in Shitty Chitty Bang Bang. But yeah, I would highly recommend checking that out. It's delightful.
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad you brought up the beginning of the film. Something that Back to the Future, I think, really excels at, and what makes it work. There have been hours, hours of YouTube videos, books, entire books written about what makes Back to the Future work. But for me, distilled down to one sentence, it would be visual storytelling. And that opening of, the film in Doc's study, office, lab, whatever, establishes first of all, I think both characters, frankly, because when Marty comes in and plugs in his guitar to the huge amplifier, you really learn a lot about him. But everything from the automated, almost like Rube Goldberg-esque, mechanical dog feeder to the plutonium that the case is kind of visible underneath the bed, and Marty's skateboard hits it right when he first comes in. You realize that the entire story, this place that's feeling lived in, really exists, and the film is showing you these things. Every setup has a payoff. Everything is a setup that then has a payoff, and it's so rare to see a film as economical as Back to the Future in terms of the dialogue, and every scene has a counter scene, and it's kind of a really high-end way that surely in some ways must have been an accident, but the finished product is that one-to-one polished, where there's a setup and a payoff, and it just feels like a treat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that adds to the rewatchability, because if you don't catch stuff like that the first time around, then you'll catch it the second time, or it'll make you want to rewatch it again when things come back up. Like, I think that you brought up the plutonium case. Isn't the TV going on in the background too, with like the talking about
Oh,
how
the break-in.
yeah,
Yeah.
the break-in, that like the plutonium was stolen, and then you pan over to the case, and then you think, oh, okay, well, like that makes sense. Like, well, if you have like, if you're, I think if you're watching this through an adult's eyes, and you know it's about time travel, and but even if you've never seen it before, you think, well, like, okay, that makes sense. They might need plutonium to time travel, but you don't think that the Libyans are going to come back into play, and like that's going to be,
Yeah.
kind of like the catalyst for Marty wanting to go back. So you're right. Like, there's a lot of callbacks as you keep progressing, and yeah, I just think that that's what makes rewatching it so much fun.
Yeah. Well, and that's definitely the question as far as like what, 'cause Back to the Future is a movie that I rewatch a lot. And I gotta say, like, these days there are very few films I rewatch a lot. As
Mm.
a kid, it was, always on repeat, like I said, but as an adult, this is one I'll still go back to, and I think part of it is the feeding of my soul with just such a,
Mm.
the laughs still land.
Yeah. Is it like just like a comfort movie for you, or do you tend to rewatch it during certain times of the year, for example?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think probably in summertime, maybe, yeah, more than
Hmm.
any other time of the year. Something about it feels like, because even though Marty's in school, it feels like getting out of school, going 30 years away from your school, having never
Yeah.
to come
The
back, kind
ultimate
of.
vacation.
Yeah, the ultimate vacation. Even though he enrolls himself as a student
Yeah, he
in the
just goes
50s,
back to school.
he just goes back to school the whole time. He really should have been, yeah. But no, I think it's definitely a summer movie. It's something that
Hmm.
and really, the sequels, like the whole trilogy, um, are that same way for me, where I'll watch one and then the other, and it all feels good. It feels like I'm getting something new, something old, something familiar. It feels like an education in an interesting
Hmm.
way, just watching it. Oh,
I like it.
yeah. But it's interesting that, speaking of sequels briefly, something that has come up over the years, especially as Hollywood has continued to rely on reboots and sequels to popular movies. And if you name an iconic movie from the 80s, the odds are that there's been a sequel for it. We just talked about Beetlejuice recently, within the last 6 months, getting its follow up major motion picture. And other ones like Tron 2 have been rebooted, sequelized, or getting a third entry. Back to the Future has not. Back to the Future, one of the reasons it's a beloved trilogy, and it's funny because when I was thinking about this, I was like, oh, Indiana Jones, another trilogy. But no, there have been 5 Indiana Joneses released in theaters, so we can't even say, like, Back to the Future is going to end up being the most iconic trilogy of all time, simply by the virtue of it only being a trilogy. Even 10 years from now, it'll only ever be a trilogy, and that's why it's winning. Like, Star Wars isn't a trilogy anymore. It hasn't been since the late 90s.
Right.
So Back to the Future. But anyway, what I'm getting at is, Bob Zemeckis and Bob Gale have decreed that there will not be a sequel made to Back to the Future, to the original 3 films, in their lifetime. They are against it entirely. The idea of sequels that you would recapture or attempt to recapture something that happened, they're against it. And they have held fast. You better believe they're probably being offered a ton of money to revisit Back to the Future. Can you imagine Back to the Future uh, rebooted and today, casting today's actors for it?
I no, I mean, like, and people still just get so excited about even like a tidbit of Back to the Future being referenced or showcased in any other property. I know you put this later on in the doc, but like Ready Player One is a great example of that. People were so excited to see when they did the movie adaptation of the book that they were able to get the rights to include the DeLorean, for example. And that's probably the closest you're going to get to seeing the DeLorean back on the big screen is like some kind of cameo, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, well, but it's also been funny to track where and when that sort of thing shows up, right? Whether
Yeah,
it's
yeah. I mean, I think
actors.
it says a lot about the respect they have for their own creative property
That's
if they are
exactly it. Like,
selective.
and the idea that, I mean, I'm sure they were chuffed when the DeLorean was such a big part of Ready Player One. Like, the characters, chosen avatar drives around in it. To just
Right.
see that in the movie so much, it's like getting a Back to the Future sequel. But,
Exactly.
so it's such a creative and I think cool way to honor the film's legacy without trying to say we're going to actively recreate it. The DeLorean itself, like the film, popularized this otherwise not very well known car. It was a flop. The car was a flop. And the owner was in some legal trouble, financial trouble too. And, really the film's use of the DeLorean and its stainless steel construction makes it perfect for time travel, like really just brought this iconic sense of like, what even is this? The DeLorean itself feels like a car out of time. So now you turn it into a time machine and you're like, well, here we go, here we are, with it. It's just so much of it feels perfectly like inspired and perfectly executed. But the way that we're able to look back all these years and say there were only 3 Back to the Future films, I think is a testament to like the strong creative vision of the men who brought it to life.
Mm-hmm.
So that's very exciting. And for me, also tracking, I'm vaguely aware that there was an animated series of Back to the Future.
I saw when you put this in the doc, it unlocked a memory that I had completely forgotten that was a thing, and I also just have very vague memories of this airing, similar to how I had very vague memories of the animated Beetlejuice, also probably airing around the same
Oh,
time.
yeah, that one was on TV a lot that I would watch.
Yeah, yeah, but yeah, I very vaguely remember the Back to the Future animated series.
Yeah. Well, I found out yesterday. I was chatting with Robert, who's been on the show
Mm-hmm.
recently. And he told me something I never knew about Back to the Future animated series, which is that there was a live action component where Christopher Lloyd would intro and outro the episode. But in that live action segment, Doc Brown had a lab assistant who would help him showcase some experiments. And the lab
Mm.
assistant was played by Bill Nye, the science guy. Prior to
Aha.
prior to Bill Nye the Science Guy, the show. So basically, Bill Nye the Science Guy is canonically existing in the Back to the Future universe.
Mm-hmm.
Utter craziness. I mean, all the things now talk about a show that shaped us. Bill Nye the Science Guy was always on in science class or in gym class when we rolled the TV card out for some reason. Like, we watched so much of that show in school.
Yeah, I remember
So,
that too.
mm.
I don't know if you, I don't think you put this in here, but I will give an honorable mention to the Back to the Future musical. That's a thing
Yeah,
too.
you know
That's
what?
kind of
Yeah,
like the
I've been
film the
sleeping on it.
adaptation that I
Have you seen it?
yeah. I haven't, but I it toured through the city not long ago. I think if I remember correctly. And it just wasn't on the top of my list. I don't know. It seems like a weird thing to adapt into a musical, but then again, like, going back to Beetlejuice, which is getting brought up a lot. Shout out to the Beetlejuice episode, by the way, if you guys want to revisit
Yeah.
another, episode of What the Hype that's similar to what we're doing here. That would be a good touchstone for y'all to go over to. But like, they've done that into musical. Adam's Family has been turned into a musical, so why not Back to the Future?
Pretty
I'd be
much
curious to
everything we
see how they
touch
do
on
it.
What the hype, the litmus, the rule of thumb is if it's been a musical, we'll talk about it, and if it's not, even though we never set out to talk about the musical, but
Mm-hmm.
no, I hear good things about the Back to the Future musical, and the cast is well loved in their roles too. But again, another way of doing not a sequel,
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
in a clever way. So it's pretty cool.
Mm-hmm.
But Let's talk more about, I want to talk more about the plot of, the first movie, and kind of what's this experience like of revisiting and seeing your parents when they were kids. Growing up, you kind of feel like, oh, my parents are, they're adults, they're older than me. They were never as young as I was. And there's this, to your point, Pam, about like teenage rebelliousness, there's this idea that your parents would never understand you because you're a teenager and you have these desires and, wants and needs. But then come to find out that no, your parents were that age once, and kind of what that is like. Just this film explores, I think, that specifically in a really creative or in your face kind of way.
Yeah, I think specifically in regards to Marty's um uh like I guess the way that he sees his mom, I think that's the most drastic shift in a way, because his dad is really unchanged from like the beginning of the film to when he meets him. But I think that he realizes, like, as the movie progresses, that he just hasn't gone through his transition yet, and we see that happen towards the end of the movie, right? But I think that the way Marty sees his mom completely shifts when he meets her in the past, and part of that is her own doing, right? But I think all parents, they tend to button up a little more when they have kids, because it's always do as I say, not as I do, you know.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
it's easier to
When I
toe that line if you're not
yeah.
divulging,
When
what
I
you were
was your
really
age, I
like
never
when you
called
were.
the boy
Yeah,
or
exactly.
sat in a
Yeah,
parked
I never
car
even
with the
looked at a
boy.
boy.
Yeah, never,
Meanwhile, she's
never,
like
never once
super
looked.
thirsty.
Oh, it's mega thirsty. Yeah, but that aspect of, I think, both of his parents living like a repressed version of themselves,
Hmm.
and having subdued that side of themselves, and to find that throughout the course of the movie, I think I'd say both versions of Marty's parents in the future, when he does get back to it, are living a little bit more authentically. They've done a little bit better for themselves. They
Yeah.
probably don't, like the change, I think, is that they have been able to, through the plot of the film, come into their own. I mean, George McFly specifically being able to punch out Biff, instead of just resenting the relationship for 30 years. And we see what that has
Yeah.
become at the beginning of the movie.
Yeah. They've
So,
also they've retained some of that youthfulness that they were
yeah.
lacking at the beginning. And
Yeah.
you see how that completely changes also how Marty's older siblings
Yeah.
turn out, because
The,
they of course they would, because the parents raised would you would have raised them differently if you were different people.
yeah.
And so
But
all those little slight shifts, it's, honestly, like, Back to the Future is like the perfect, easily digestible example of the, like, the butterfly effect, basically, in terms of time travel. It's just all these tiny little changes that ended making big changes.
yeah, like, what are you wearing, Dave? What, Marty? I always wear a suit to the office. Like, really. Meanwhile, at the beginning
Yeah.
of the film, he was off, I don't know, camping somewhere. But yeah, it just goes to show that, and the only change was his parents were, maintained a little bit more of their youth.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of wild, and it plays back into, I think, how cool it is to be a teenager. Specifically in the 80s, how cool it is to be surrounded by, you got your Walkman and you got your cool life preserver fashion, and, cool skateboard, and can go anywhere. I mean, the skateboard, much like the car, represents freedom and the time travel. You can go anywhere you want, hypothetically. So there's all this, like, potential for the future that really makes the first film, which doesn't go to the future, exciting in, like, a contained story. Is like, okay, I think that the way that the first film ends with, Doc going off to the future, and at the very, very end coming back and being like, we gotta fix something, shows that, it's inspiring, really, because we don't know what our own lives will hold 30 years down the line, But maybe the lesson of the first film is, try and retain what makes you youthful, and there
Mm-hmm.
you'll go right, because we ultimately see Marty and Jennifer fall into the same hole that the parents did at the beginning of the first film in the beginning of the second film, where it really seems like
Yeah.
they didn't kind of remember what makes them youthful.
Yeah, yeah, that's such a good point.
So, but we'll talk more about that when we eventually discuss at length the second Back to the Future film, which is not going to be this week. But let's talk more, just kind of as an overview again about movie one. What are the scenes that we go back to or remember? What are the other characters that we remember? I mean, Biff, we touched on briefly. Biff as a character, we all had a bully. I like to think. I shudder to think, but there's this character that is good looking, not very bright, who makes others' lives uncomfortable and a mess. And he's being given, kind of a fair bit of free reign by teachers. And the idea that you can, as the hero of the story, continually subvert the bully and, excel is a hopeful message to get.
Yeah, I mean, again, he is just the textbook jockey bully. In a lot of ways, he's like everything you want to see from a stereotypical jock bully in a movie like this. Not very bright, but somehow, I guess like that's why people like that overcompensate and have to make other people's lives miserable, right? Because
What are
that's the
you
only
looking
way to
at,
get ahead.
butthead?
Yeah.
Why
I
don't you
also
make
love
like a
too
tree? Get
the
out of here.
crashing into the manure and then they're all
Oh,
just yelling shit.
shit.
Yeah.
There's so much slapstick
Yeah.
in the
There is,
film.
yeah. But
Yeah.
and yet it doesn't feel hokey. It's just funny. Because
Well,
they
and
don't
something.
really like, it's like I think that they do a good job of like it's like yes, like yelling shit while manure is moments away from dropping into your car, like it's stating the obvious, but then it's really not because like you might not realize that it's actual manure unless you're reading, the side of the cart that it's on, for example.
Yeah,
So
which they can't do if
yeah,
they're right behind it. Um,
exactly. Yeah, it's funny because I think that like the idea that you always like, and it's not like really true to life, but like the idea that Hollywood has spoon fed us a lot in the 80s and 90s is that like your bullies are going to end up being losers in real life when you all grow up, right? And so it's funny that like at the beginning of the movie it's Biff who's on top, but then as a result of Marty going back in time, like his dad's bully has fallen from grace by the end of the movie, which is how like if real life works out, it's how it should be, right? Karmic justice should
yeah,
come into play. It doesn't always, but every
yeah,
once in a while
and
it
it took a
does.
little assertiveness, I think, on the part of
Right.
George McFly to show that no, ultimately you can't walk over me. And it's kind of funny how like the relationship between Marty and his father in the 50s, because the original way in which his parents fell in love was that George was hit by a car and his mom just felt sorry for him, and their entire relationship in the future in the 80s is based on the premise of I feel sorry for this man. And so there is your kind of subjugation of self, subduing of self in Lorraine that leads to, kind of just an unhappy marriage. The scene around the TV where George is pouring some cereal for dinner,
Mm-hmm.
is just so ridiculous. And he's laughing, at the TV, and Lorraine's just like, oh God, what have I done? Now Marty has to teach his dad to fight what's supposed to be him, and really kind of be a man, really to just take charge of your own life a little bit, and how that ends up invigorating and working out to an otherwise very like myopic loner of George, who would just as soon be reading some kind of foreign science fiction novel about aliens.
Yeah, he needs that confidence boost of knowing that he can do it, right? Because another way to think about it is that like, you know, they fall in love because and Lorraine is the one that's taking care of him, literally,
Hmm.
and then like clearly spends the rest of their lives together in Marty's first reality, still taking care of George. But then George is the one that's taking care of her when she needs it most after Marty disrupts their initial timeline. And so, yeah.
And then later, presumably being a published author will mean he's taking care of the family, as a primary income later. Yeah. That's so interesting. There's definitely a way to like talk about gender roles and how that has like
Yeah.
manifested in the movie.
And it would make sense too that like that is like they're a little bit more stereotypical gender roles, just not only because of the time, but also because of the fact that half of this movie is staunchly steeped in an era where gender roles were really kind of at the forefront of family dynamics in general. So the 50s is that's like the cleaver era, like the June cleavers of the world. So
Mm-hmm. So we haven't, I don't think, talked enough about Doc. I've said
yes.
before how he wouldn't work in any other movie. And I think I think even Christopher Lloyd has said, that kind of thing. But it works so well in this movie, and particularly as a friend to Marty. The sequels go into it more, but you do see a level of reliance and a level of trust that exists between Doc and Marty in the 80s, even though together in the 80s they're only together for maybe 2 hours of like lifetime in that experience. But I think that when you look at what the characters give to each other, I think Doc gives Marty some direction, right? Some legitimacy in terms of like the world is cool and you're okay to think that it's cool. And, in Marty, Doc has somebody to find his life as cool and his life trajectory as being valid, because it's got to be a very sort of solo, lonely existence, to be Doc Brown.
I think it probably goes a long way too. Like anytime as a like when you're a teenager, if somebody is taking you seriously, that's like the best thing they can do for you, especially if it's an adult.
Yeah.
And so the fact that like, Doc clearly values Marty and also like trusts him to like, for example, show up at the local mall at what is it like
Well,
one
yeah.
15.
I mean, he's got to remind him. He's got to call
Some
him. But yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But
Yeah.
still, like, he trusts him to be there, gives him some semblance of responsibility and structure, for example. And like at the end of the day, like it is Doc getting him into a little bit of trouble, sure, but for the most part it's pretty clean trouble. So
Yeah, just living
there's a bit
terrorists,
of like
no big deal.
rebellious,
Yeah.
yeah,
It's just going to be.
business in there. It's like it's a little dangerous, so that might appeal to a teenager as well. But I think ultimately it is the fact that like, he respects him as an equal, even though he's a teenager.
Yeah, and there is that level of like I think they are equals in that way.
Mm-hmm.
Like they both have that. I don't know. They don't. It's not that they seek mischief. It's that mischief. Like Doc's chosen profession is mischief. Chemistry is blowing things up. And he's managed to succeed at creating a working, functioning time machine. It's basically science is the most violent act. Because you're tearing back the fabric of the universe and manipulating it. And for Marty to, kind of not feel so much as like a rebel, in retrospect, I think it humanizes Marty a lot as being like, well, I've never done anything this crazy. One time I plugged my guitar into an amp and it exploded, but I'm not,
Right.
using plutonium to blow myself 30
Yeah.
years in either direction on the timeline.
The other thing I like about that too is that like I mean like obviously we don't see Doc's reaction to finding out that he blew the amp out, but somehow you just know that Doc isn't going to be mad at him for it. And I think there's
Right.
something so endearing about that he just like completely wrecked his home lab, and you just know he's not going to be upset. It's like just
Yeah.
another day.
He's gonna be my theory is confirmed.
Right, exactly.
The chance of overload was higher than I thought. Oh, man. Well, we are also going to talk briefly about the Back to the Future sequels, of which there were 2 and only 2, as we said, after another word from our sponsors.